In the summer of 1968, on the back lot of a studio in Culver City, California, on a Thursday afternoon when the temperature on the asphalt measured 104 degrees, a crowd of 23 men gathered in a loose half-circle around a mat laid flat on the ground. Most of them were stunt coordinators, fight choreographers, or working martial artists who had been brought in as technical consultants on a film that would never get made. They had been standing in that heat for the better part of an hour. They were not restless. They were watching. At the far edge of the mat, a man of 28 years was running through a sequence with the controlled economy of someone who had done it 10,000 times. His name was Bruce Lee. He stood 5 feet 7 inches. He weighed 138 pounds on the heaviest day of his life. His arms, when he extended them, cast shadows on the mat that looked disproportionate to his body, which is the first thing trained men noticed when they watched him move. He was not warming up. He was already warm. He was simply moving the way he always moved, which was without hesitation and without visible effort, which is another way of saying that what he was doing looked easy, and nothing about it was. On the opposite edge of that same mat, a man of 28 years was standing with his arms folded. He had arrived 40 minutes earlier in a car he drove himself, which meant he had no assistant, no manager, and no entourage, and that detail alone should have told the 23 men something about his nature. His name was Chuck Norris. He held the professional middleweight karate world championship title, which he had won the previous year in a tournament in which he did not lose a single point in 4 consecutive bouts. He had a record in full contact competition of 168 wins against 10 losses. Of those 168 wins, 101 had been decided before the round was complete. He was 5 feet 10 inches. He weighed 175 pounds. His hands, when he held them at rest, showed the particular callousing that accumulates only over a decade of deliberate daily contact with hard surfaces. He had fought 200 men in competition. He had made that number known in an interview published in a martial arts trade magazine 3 weeks before that Thursday, and several of the 23 men on that backlot had read it. One of them was Bruce Lee. In the next 6 seconds of story time, something would happen on that mat that the 23 witnesses would carry with them for the rest of their professional lives. Some of them would tell the story once, some would tell it hundreds of times. All of them would tell it the same way. Nobody standing on that asphalt in the summer of 1968 understood yet what they were about to see. Not the stunt coordinators, not the choreographers, not the man with 168 wins. Nobody in that half-circle knew they were watching the beginning of something that would not be fully understood for another 30 years. The studio that had assembled them was attempting to build a film around a concept that required, in the words of the production brief, an authentic representation of combat between trained men at the highest level. The director had hired 2 technical consultants for that purpose. One of them had been on the lot since 7 in the morning. The other had arrived at noon, and that was Chuck Norris, and the reason he arrived at noon was that he had driven from a gym in the San Fernando Valley where he had been training since 5. And he had stopped once for coffee, which he finished in the car. The man who hired him, a choreographer named Alan Blanchard, had worked with more than 60 professional fighters over the course of a 12-year career. He would later say, in a letter written to a colleague in 1994, that he had never in his professional life arranged 2 men on a mat with less certainty about what the afternoon would produce. He had worked with karate champions. He had worked with wrestlers. He had worked with men who had genuine records in genuine competition. He understood what trained men looked like from the outside. He had never worked with Bruce Lee. The 23 men on the backlot understood Chuck Norris. They had read the interview. They had seen the record. 200 men was not a rhetorical number. It was a documented number drawn from scorecards and tournament records, and the men who followed professional karate knew exactly what it represented. A record of 168-10 across 8 years of active competition in the sport's most contested weight class was not a reputation. It was a fact. Chuck Norris was the specific kind of dangerous that could be measured and confirmed, and in a room full of men who understood measurement, that confirmation carried weight. Bruce Lee was something different. He was known. His name was known. His speed was spoken about in terms that trained men used cautiously because trained men knew that speed in conversation almost always exceeded speed in reality. People said Bruce Lee was fast in the way people said a car was fast before they had driven it, which is to say they said it without precise knowledge of what fast actually meant to them. He had no competitive record. He had no tournament titles. He had demonstrations, which were not the same thing. Blanchard placed them on opposite ends of the mat and gave them a simple direction. He asked them to spar at 50% with contact limited to the chest and arms. He wanted to see how their ranges interacted. That was the professional language he used. Ranges, as if distance between two men was a technical problem with a technical solution. He stepped back from the mat. He put both hands in the pockets of his trousers. Chuck Norris unfolded his arms. He placed his right foot 18 inches behind his left, weight distributed across the back heel in the particular stance of a man who had arrived at that placement through a decade of deliberate experimentation. He did not bounce. He did not roll his neck. He did not make a sound. He looked across 14 feet of mat at the smaller man and waited. He had beaten 200 men. He had beaten men larger than himself. He had beaten men faster than himself, or men who had been described to him as faster. He had a system for faster men, which was a system of patience and angle and the management of distance, and it had worked against 168 of the 178 men he had put it against. He waited. Bruce Lee did not take a stance. He simply stopped moving through the sequence he had been running and turned to face the man across the mat. He stood with his feet roughly parallel, his hands at his sides, his weight balanced in the way a person stands when they are waiting for something, which is to say, he stood as if the contest had not yet begun, which from where he was standing, it had not. Chuck Norris took the first step forward. If you have found this story worth your time, and if you want to hear what happened in the 6 seconds that followed, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. There are viewers of this channel on 6 continents, and we read every one of them. Chuck Norris took the first step forward, and what happened next was this. Second one. He closed the distance by 3 feet. His lead hand came up in a probing jab, not committed, not intended to land, intended to measure. In 23 years of training and 8 years of competition, the probing jab had given Chuck Norris more information about an opponent than any other single movement. The jab told him speed. The jab told him reflex. The jab told him whether the man across from him moved from the shoulder or from the hip. Every man he had put the probing jab against had responded in one of 4 ways, and he had a prepared answer for each of the 4. Bruce Lee was not across from him. The jab arrived where Bruce Lee had been standing. Bruce Lee was 6 inches to the left of where he had been standing, and the movement that had taken him there had not involved his upper body. His shoulders had not shifted. His head had not turned. He had simply moved his feet and brought the rest of himself with them, and the whole of the movement had been so compressed and so unhurried in its expression that 3 of the 23 men watching from the perimeter would later report, independently of one another, that they had not seen it happen. They had seen Chuck Norris's jab land on air. And then they had recalculated where Bruce Lee was standing, and they could not account for the interval between the 2 observations. Alan Blanchard at the perimeter did not put his hands in his pockets, he took them out. Second 2, Chuck Norris reset. He was a man of 8 years of competition, and he did not require a moment to process what had happened because he had been in the presence of unexpectedly fast men before, and he knew that a fast man and a dangerous man were related but not identical. He closed the angle by a half step, changing his relationship to the mat by moving laterally rather than forward, which was the specific language of a man who understood that forward is the most expensive direction to travel against an opponent you have not yet fully read. His rear hand came up. He had a rear hook thrown from the right side that had finished 34 of his 101 early victories. It was not the fastest technique in his arsenal, it was the most structurally sound. It did not require the precise positioning that his faster techniques required. It was, in the taxonomy of his fighting system, a technique for uncertain situations. He threw it. A fight is not 2 men striking each other. A fight is a negotiation about distance. The man who controls the distance controls the terms of the conversation, and the man who controls the terms controls the outcome. Every serious fighting system in the world is, at its foundation, a curriculum about distance. What separates the men who win from the men who do not is not the size of the techniques in their vocabulary. It is the precision with which they can set and reset the distance from which those techniques depart. Bruce Lee understood this more completely than almost anyone alive in the summer of 1968. The rear hook passed through the space where Bruce Lee's jaw had been. Bruce Lee had not leaned back. He had not stepped away. He had moved his head by approximately 4 inches in a direction that was neither left nor right but downward and slightly forward, which meant he had moved toward the incoming technique rather than away from it. Which meant that when Chuck Norris's rear hand reached the terminal point of its arc, Bruce Lee was beneath it and 6 inches closer to Chuck Norris than he had been when the technique was thrown. Blanchard said nothing. He was watching with the specific attentiveness of a man who is in the presence of something he cannot yet classify. The tournament director, a man named George Minowa, who had officiated at more than 300 competitive bouts and who had been invited to the lot as a courtesy, was standing to Blanchard's left with a clipboard he had stopped writing on. He would say afterward that he set the clipboard down at this moment, though he did not remember doing it. He remembered looking down and seeing it resting against his knee and not knowing when he had moved it. Second 3. Chuck Norris was a champion for reasons that went beyond his technical library. The primary reason was that he did not panic. The 2 failed techniques had given him information, and he was a man who processed information quickly and without the interference of pride. He took 3 steps backward, not 1 step. 3, he reset to the distance from which he had opened, which was 14 feet, and he stopped, and he looked at the smaller man who was now standing inside the range at which the interaction had started. He had beaten 200 men. The magazine interview in which he had said it had been straightforward. The interviewer had asked him to characterize his record. He had characterized it with a number, because he was a man of exactness, and the number was exact. He had not said it with arrogance. He had said it the way a carpenter tells you how many houses he has built, which is to say he had said it as a fact about his history, not a claim about his future. He looked at the man across the mat. He had been certain before the second. He was not certain now. Second 4. Bruce Lee moved. He moved from his parallel stance without announcement, without the preparatory tensing that trained men learn to read in the shoulder of an opponent before they have been competing for very long, and he covered the distance between them in a movement that had no intermediate positions. Which is to say that he was 14 feet away and then he was not 14 feet away, and the crossing of that distance had no visible stages. His right hand was extended when he arrived, 2 knuckles forward, the wrist rotated inward, the elbow aligned to the shoulder in the geometry of a technique that had been designed to deliver force through the smallest possible contact surface at the highest possible speed. It stopped 6 inches from Chuck Norris's sternum. 6 inches. Blanchard measured it afterward with a ruler he borrowed from a prop assistant. He wanted to know the number. He needed to know the number. 6 inches was the number. The stopped fist held there for 1 full second, which in that context was a very long time, and Chuck Norris looked at it. The 23 men on the perimeter did not move. A man named Dennis Coyne, a stunt coordinator who had been working in film for 11 years and who had overseen physical sequences involving everything from boxing to sword work, would say 6 months later that the half circle simply stopped. He said it the way you describe a film that has been paused. Everything continued. The heat, the light flattening on the asphalt, the distant sound of a truck on the service road 400 yards to the east, and the 23 men in the half circle did not continue. They were fixed in place by something they could not name, but could feel in the particular quiet that settles over trained people when they are in the presence of something they were not prepared for. Minowa's clipboard was on the ground. He had not picked it up. Blanchard's hands were at his sides. Second 5. Bruce Lee withdrew the fist. He stepped backward once, returning to the distance from which he had come. He placed his feet back in their parallel position. He held his hands at his sides. He said nothing. Second 6. Chuck Norris did not move for the length of that second. He was a still man by nature, but this stillness was a different kind. It was the stillness of a man arriving at a conclusion which takes longer than people imagine when they have not watched it happen in real time. Then he did something that the 23 men would talk about for 30 years. He lowered his hands, not in surrender, not in defeat. He lowered his hands in the specific way a craftsman sets down a tool when he has been shown a better one, which is a gesture of recognition, not of defeat, and the difference between those two things is everything. He took one step forward, not to close the distance but to confirm it. He extended his right hand across the space between them. Bruce Lee took it. They stood there for a moment that no one thought to time. And then Chuck Norris said something. He said it quietly, in a voice that the nearest men could hear, but that did not carry to the back of the half circle, and the 4 men who were close enough to register the words would each remember them slightly differently, the way words that matter always drift slightly in transit between one person's memory and another's. What they agreed on was the shape of it. They agreed that it was not an apology because there was nothing to apologize for, and it was not a qualification because he was not a man who qualified. It was an acknowledgement. It was a man who had built his understanding of combat across a decade of genuine competition, saying, in the specific plainness of a man who does not use more words than the situation requires, that he had just been shown something he had not previously known existed. The men near enough to hear said he said something close to, "I have never seen that." He said it without embarrassment. He said it without the careful hedging that lesser men use when they have been surprised in front of witnesses. He said it the way you state a fact, when the fact is all there is to say. And then he picked up his jacket from the chair where he had left it, folded it once across his forearm and walked off the mat. He did not leave the lot. He sat down at the edge of the half circle and he watched Bruce Lee move for the next 40 minutes without saying another word, and several of the witnesses said afterward that he watched with the focused attention of a man who is memorizing something, which is what he was doing. George Minowa would later write about that afternoon in a letter to a fellow official that was published, with permission, in a martial arts journal in 1987. He wrote that he had spent 20 years in rooms where trained men tested each other, and that he had a reliable sense for what each kind of room cost the men inside it. He wrote that what he had watched on that backlot had cost Chuck Norris something, and that what it had cost him was a certainty about the outer limit of speed that he had carried for 8 years without revision. He also wrote, and this is the part of the letter that the journal's editor chose to excerpt first, that he had never in his career seen a man revise that kind of certainty with more composure than Chuck Norris had revised it that afternoon. The story left the lot with 23 men who had 23 different versions of the same afternoon in their memories. In the months that followed, it moved through studios and dojos and production offices with the particular velocity of a story that is true, which is faster than most people expect. By 1971, a version of it had reached practitioners in 3 countries who had not been present. By 1975, there were versions of it that had acquired details nobody present could account for, a bet placed beforehand. A crowd of 200 rather than 23, a comment made in a locker room that no locker room on the lot had actually contained. This is what happens to stories when they are worth telling. They grow. They accumulate. The true structure remains, and the decorative material that attaches to it is a kind of tribute to the core, which is that something real happened on a mat in Culver City in the summer of 1968, and every person who was there knew it was real before the 6th second had finished. Blanchard kept the ruler. The prop assistant asked for it back twice. Blanchard returned it eventually, and by then he had measured the 6 inches so many times that the measurement was redundant, but he kept measuring because there are some gaps a person needs to close repeatedly before they can leave them alone. Bruce Lee would go on to make films that put his name in front of audiences in 47 countries. The techniques he demonstrated that Thursday would be analyzed, cataloged, and studied by martial artists across 4 decades, though most of those analysts were working from film and had never been in a room where those techniques were applied to a specific person with a specific history. Chuck Norris would continue his career in competition and eventually in film, and he would carry the afternoon with him the way men carry the most clarifying moments of their professional lives, which is quietly and completely without revision. He spoke about it publicly for the first time in a radio interview in 1983, 15 years after the fact. The interviewer asked him if he had ever been surprised in training. He thought for a moment and said that surprise was probably not the right word. He said the right word was educated. He said there had been one afternoon in his career that had educated him more completely than any single afternoon before or after it. The interviewer asked if he would name it. He did not name it. He said only that it had happened early, which was the right time for it, and that he was glad it had. It is a particular kind of wisdom that does not require an audience. It does not ask to be credited, does not build itself a monument, does not circle back to the moment it was formed and point. It simply informs the work that follows, quietly, the way a correct foundation informs every wall built on top of it without ever being visible from the street. The story a man tells about himself is written before the match. The story that is true is written during it. Chuck Norris had told a story about 200 men, and it was a true story, and none of those 200 men had taken it from him. What happened on a mat in Culver City in the summer of 1968 did not take it from him either. It did something more permanent. It added a chapter that could not be removed, and the chapter was not about defeat, because there was no defeat. The chapter was about the specific rarity of a man who meets a wall and does not look for a door marked exception. He set the jacket on his arm and walked off the mat and sat down and watched. That is the whole of it. That is the story. And in the whole of it, there is the only lesson worth carrying, that the man most worth becoming is the man who, having built the longest possible record of what he is capable of, arrives at the edge of it without flinching and says, with plainness and without theater, "I have never seen that." Because that sentence is not the end of the record. It is the beginning of a better one. Next week we will tell the story of the afternoon on a film set in Hong Kong when Chuck Norris arrived for what was listed on the call sheet as a rehearsal, and what it became instead, and why the director of that film would say 30 years later that no scene he had ever staged had cost him more or taught him more than the one he had not planned.